Nam Anh kính chào quý vị. Hôm nay thứ Ba, 23 tháng 11 năm 2021. Đến với bản tin Hoa Thịnh Đốn tối nay là phần 2 và phần 3, phỏng vấn đặc biệt. Để mở đầu, Nam Anh kính mời quý vị theo dõi tiếp phần 2, chương trình phỏng vấn đặc biệt sử gia George J. Veight, nội dung tìm hiểu về tác phẩm Tôi muốn kể lại chuyện của tôi, ký giả Nguyễn Tú và Cái Giá của sự can đảm. Chương trình do Phan Dũng và Minh Thuý thực hiện, được phát hình bằng Anh ngữ và có phụ đề Việt ngữ.
So idealistically, do you think just because of the different point of view or because personal thing that you say that doesn't speak highly of him? Because he could, you know how you can speak highly of your enemy in a way.
Yes.
Does he have that with Pham? Well, not really.
I don't think so. I think he's, Tu was a battlefield correspondent. He would go out to the military, out to the field. Whereas Pham was in Saigon, sitting at the coffee house with rumors and stuff. So I think he never considered Pham a real journalist, just someone who was working in the industry.
But one could argue really the other way, because Pham is right there, but he's working for the system and he's a spy somehow. He's not sitting there just having a coffee as you and me.
Yes.
So I don't know whether that judgment is correct with him, because it seems like he knows Pham, but somehow something about Mr. Tu that he never have a definite idea on opinion on one of the person.
Well, as I said, he didn't say anything overly negative or overly positive. He just said, I knew him and he treated me like a respected elder, and I didn't know he was a communist. So it was sometimes hard to get a real definitive opinion on somebody from him. I think he was just a very humble person that way.
Or reserved.
Or reserved, yes, as you say, reserved.
It's for something else other than, just the mark of humble.
Yes.
I know he's the humble man, but I don't think humbleness is the whole thing that's after.
You're probably right, yes.
And his idea about American, do you think he's fair? You wrote about one of the incidents when he went out on an ambush of an American unit. And in the middle of the night, one of the soldiers would just cried out, I miss my mom.
Yes.
And there goes. He couldn't make it anymore. And his conclusion was like, well, they fought very well. They had discipline, but they did not understand the war.
Yes, he was always of the opinion that the American soldiers, we should not have put American soldiers on the ground. To him, the American military should just have been trainers, advisors, giving aid, giving money, but not soldiers on the ground. It should have been the South Vietnamese doing the fighting. And I think in many ways he was right about that, because it was almost impossible for an American 18-year-old from Kansas to go to Vietnam and does not understand the language, does not understand the culture in a completely different environment, and to operate effectively. And so I think he had a high opinion of Americans, but he did not think that they should have been fighting for South Vietnam.
Do you think that's correct from your point of view as an American, now that you look back?
Well, I think in some ways, if you sort of look at things, yes, I think it was probably a mistake for the Americans to put so many troops into South Vietnam. But the problem is that the North Vietnamese army could as many Americans as we could put in, the North Vietnamese could counter, So at what point, where do you draw the line? Is it only American firepower and aid, or do you have to put combat troops in also to help?
So is that a very practical question for the American to be involved in Vietnam? They have to somehow have some kind of a control. Like, I wouldn't say that you put your money down and you want to see some progress. You have to have somebody to monitor it. How do you do it without?
Well, that's always that's the hard question, because when you are putting money into some place, especially for the U.S. government, you have to account for that money. You have to say, well, where did you spend the money, and what results did you get? So it was always a extraordinarily difficult thing for the American government to try not to interfere, but still had to interfere.
That's right. Well, you want to cooperate with someone, there's a degree that you need to stop, but you don't know where to draw the sand. So that, I think that was the problem, and that's how he feels.
Yes.
So he feels one way, but I'm not sure whether that's correct way. I mean, because I'm not an American, so I can't tell what you exactly see. That's the one. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's, you know, I wasn't in the war, so it's hard for me to say, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think it was we were trying to help South Vietnam defend itself, and we were trying to build the country at the same time defend itself. And once you get in, it's hard to get out, you know. So once you get in, you start adding more and more and more because the North Vietnamese army kept coming down. So after a while, it began to just grow and grow and grow.
I think Mr. Tu has disagreed not only with the American, but most of his friends also. And this one comes back to the time when he was in Hanoi and talking about the French, and he said, when you're fighting, you have to choose your enemy. So he said he chose the communists first and then the French second.
No, the French first.
I'm sorry.
The French first, yes.
How do you feel about his choice? Is he correct?
Well, I think that was the choice of a lot of nationalist Vietnamese. You had to choose. To him, the French were never going to win. They were going to lose at some point and leave. So he called them a declining power. Whereas the communists, in his mind, were an ascending power. So he wasn't choosing the French to choose the French. He was trying to choose the non-communists of which the French were supporting. And he hoped eventually that the non-communists could be strong enough to defeat the communists when the French left. That was how he was that's how he viewed it.
Yeah, and he was, of course, you wrote about it. It was treated as a turncoat
some of his friends who went with the communists or who could only see one thing, which was to kick the French out. So they chose the communists as the best way to kick the French out, not knowing that the communists were the greater evil, as they say, you know.
Now it comes to the second view. When he's looking at the Vietnamese army, his view is very different from the journalists as well. So not only from the political point of view, but also from the military point of view. He looked at the Vietnamese, yes, they're not experienced, but they're different kind of people. Most of the journalists have a tendency to say that, yeah, Vietnamese don't want to fight, they have corrupted. Soldiers just are forced to fight. They really mercenary. They're fighting only because the Americans getting the big. As long as you don't have any money coming in, like in 1975, and that's it. But Mr. Tu is completely almost, seeing it the other way around. And he was referring to one of the articles that he wrote about on Newsweek, where one of the American journalists saying that the Vietnamese soldiers are like rabbits compared to the lion from the north.
Yes, there was an article in Newsweek in late 1967 by an American journalist who titled the article, "Their Lions, Our Rabbits," which I think I told you or wrote in my book that I would interview Vietnamese officers 40 years later, and they still remembered that insult. And so it was an insult, and it was totally wrong. So Nguyễn Tú looked at the South Vietnamese soldiers as people trying to fight for their country, do the best they can, oftentimes with poor leadership. Whereas an American journalist who didn't speak the language, who didn't understand a lot of things, only saw it from a different cultural view, and would look at them and it came away with a bad impression. And that's unfortunate, because you also have to put yourself back into the time.
Yes.
So the mid 60s, people they thought much differently than sort of the more enlightened people we have now.
Cảm ơn quý vị vẫn giữ màn hình để tiếp tục Nam Anh kính mời quý vị theo dõi phần kết của chương trình phỏng vấn đặc biệt sử gia George J. Veight, nội dung tìm hiểu về tác phẩm Tôi muốn kể lại chuyện của tôi, Ký giả Nguyễn Tú và Cái Giá của sự can đảm. Chương trình do Phan, Dũng và Minh Thuý thực hiện, được phát hình bằng Anh ngữ và có phụ đề Việt ngữ.
So it's just unfortunate that they always see things differently. As a journalist to journalist, as soldier to soldier. It seems like the American and the Vietnamese are not looking in the same direction all the time, and never reconcile that. As far as
the problem is that American military doctrine teaches to be very aggressive, to go out and patrol all the time, go look for the enemy, go find the enemy. Whereas the South Vietnamese doctrine was, it is foolish to go into the jungle and just run around and run into booby traps and snipers and get shot at and take casualties for nothing. And so there was, I think, a lot of the problem, was because American military doctrine was to go find the enemy and fight them, which means you went patrols and you went everywhere into the jungle, whereas the South Vietnamese military was like, that's silly, let them come to us and we will kill them. So I think that was a reflection of the mindset and also a deep reason for the problem.
Let's look in another direction. Why are you writing about him now? He's been dead for like 10 years.
Well, I always wanted to write a story about him. And I had my notes for so long, but then I was focused on Black April, then I was focused on Drawn Swords, and I had to finish those. So once those books were done, I just said, I'm going to talk about my old friend, and I'm going to do this. And so I just pulled everything out and I started looking at things, and I just wanted to do it. I wanted to do it for 10 years, but I finally gave myself time to do it.
Well, you've already written 4 books about Vietnam War, and one would ask, is it possible to incorporate his life into these? Why do you feel like you should have a separate piece about him exclusively?
Because I think that, as I said, he had just witnessed and done so many things. He was really sort of like a witness to the modern history of Vietnam. He was born in the North. He was with the Dai Viets. He had fought the communists in 45, 46. He had come south. He had known so many of the very high-ranking people. He had gone everywhere in South Vietnam. He had walked around. He had been in Saigon with the most important newspaper, Chin Lun, with Dang Vinh Sung. He had known President Thieu. And so he had, and then when you talk about him being wounded in the eye and then walking down, so he had done all these things and seen all these things. To me, it is his life. To me, is a perfect
history of Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yes.
When you say that, you also see the political development that comes from the 30s to the 40s, the 50s and 70s, and maybe even now. Dai Viet's philosophy, and a lot of his friends are Dai Viet. Dang Văn Sung is in Dai Viet. He himself is in Dai Viet. Most of the people I even know is in Dai Viet. So it seems like the Dai Viet themselves does have a political vision that's against the communism. Not like Americans say we don't have anything. We do have something, but just they don't see it. Why not seeing it? I mean, they're working so close to one another, and these things seems to be so obvious. And it seems like none of the books writing about these.
Well, to answer your question, my understanding is that because the Dai Viets were very trying to be very, because the communists had killed so many of them, they became very, what we call clandestine, very secretive. And they did not have the ability to, in an open society, go out and, like a politician, talk about, here's what I'm going to do, here is my policies, here's my government. Here, they couldn't do that because either the French would arrest them or the communists would kill them. So, and then by the time the First Republic, Diem did not want the Dai Viets. He looked at them as a competitor, and so he kept them away too. So the Dai Viet party never had a chance to come out into the open, to talk about its philosophy, and to...
But finally, Theo himself is also a member of Viet. You were writing about Nguyễn Văn Kiều is Mr. Theo's elder brother.
Was one of the founders of the Southern branch. Yes.
So finally, they have it. There you go.
Well, but President Thuy never. He had joined the Viet party, but he was only there for a very short time, and he never really. He was not a person who was steeped in the Viet political philosophy. He was just a military officer who became president. So yes, he had been a Viet. Yes, his brother was a big Viet, but he never really was totally bought into the Viet political philosophy.
So finally, they seem to have it, but they never had.
I'm sorry?
They seem to have had the power, but they never had power.
Well, the only time the Viets were close to power was with the Nguyen Can government, because there was many of the cabinet ministers were Viets, and in fact it's called the Viet cabinet. But Nguyen Can very quickly began to see them plotting against him, Hat Thuy in particular, so he began to clean them out. And so by that time, by the end of '64, he had gotten rid of all the Viets.
Mr. Tu himself seems to be still a Viet party member to the last minute.
Yes, he was, yeah.
Okay, so he never say I wasn't one of them.
No, he had been in the Ministry of Youth working under President Thuy's brother Q, but he wasn't. We never really talked about that part of his life very much, so I don't know much about that. You probably know more than I do, but he only said to me that he had gotten involved with the Ministry of Youth because he was trying to convince the young people that communism was wrong, and to go a different direction.
That's the only thing?
That's the only thing I know. The only thing I talked about.
Yeah, he seldom talked about Viet, so I thought he probably told you more after the 8th interview. Well, talking about Mr. Tu is a very, very unending story.
Yes.
I mean, we could sit here and talk hours and hours from him. But now that you've already interviewed him 8 times, and only the 9th time that he told you about this thing, that's why the piece is so short. I think it's comprehensive, but still very short.
Yes.
What question would you have asked if he were here today?
Oh my goodness, that's... Oh my goodness. I think I would ask him if he looked back on his life, what he thought was the most important thing that he had done. Not only for himself, but for his people, because he never looked at himself per se. He always thought, how can I help my people, help the Vietnamese people? So I would say, what would be the most important thing that you did? And I hope this article will resurrect him and talk about his life for the South Vietnamese people.
Great. And then your expectation. What would you say about the piece? How do you expect the Vietnamese or American to react after they read the pieces? And also, how do you change after you've known Mr. Thu's story?
Right. Well,
that's the last question.
If I have my hope is that when other Vietnamese read the story, which we have translated, you have translated into Vietnamese, I hope that will encourage other Vietnamese to tell their stories, because I have said this for 15 years. Every time I've spoken in front of crowds or been asked to talk, I say the same thing, which is the communists have written many, many, many histories of the war. And American historians are using those histories now to talk about the war. So if we are not to lose the Republic of Vietnam, you have to tell your story. Write it down. Even as I say, you are a sergeant in the transportation department. Write down your stories, because if you die and you don't tell your story, that's when the communists will have really won. So it's critical to get the history written and published. And so that is what I hope people will do. They will be encouraged to tell their stories to their children, write them down, tell them to people like you, and that's when Republic of Vietnam will live forever.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
very interesting talking to you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Kính thưa quý vị, bản tin Hoa Tịnh Đốn tối nay đến đây là chấm dứt. Mọi liên lạc hay đóng góp ý kiến với ban biên tập SBTN-DC xin email về washingtondc@sbtn.tv. Nam Anh kính chúc quý vị có một buổi tối an vui và hạnh phúc bên người thân và gia đình. Nam Anh kính chào và hẹn gặp lại quý vị vào kỳ tới.